So it's the final day of our roaming sampler blanket crochet along, and all I want to do really is thank you all for joining in and emphasize the fact that you've probably got quite a long way to go until you do get to the end of your blanket. So always the idea of this one would be that over the last 10 days I've given you all the techniques that you need for you to be able to go on and continue to make your blanket as big as you wish it to be. So in today's video I'm going to cover sewing in the ends and washing and blocking, and just quickly I'm going to do some answers to the questions that you've sent in that have come along. So number one, really, can you use another weight of yarn? So the answer is yes. This is using a double knit weight of yarn. So the panels are obviously the scale that you can see here. Should you choose to use a thicker yarn like an Aran or a Chunky, the whole thing will just be scaled up. All you need to remember is you'll need a bigger hook size so that you still get movement of that fabric. So match your hook size to your yarn, so go up accordingly. And remember that it will use a lot more yarn. So yes, it will grow faster and get bigger, but every panel in terms of the weights that are stated will get much heavier as they increase. Can you use less colours then, was another question. So this one is using 7 colours. So every single panel is done in a different colour. And then actually, as you continue out using the pattern that's in the magazine to the 90 centimetres by 90 centimetres, using 7 colours, you will never be making the same stitch again in the same colour. So it's quite a satisfying pattern. The pattern will dictate how to spread those colours out for you. Obviously you don't need to though. So using single colour, you've seen that a few times in the videos, but say using 2 colours or 3 colours or 4 colours or whatever you have, all that you'll need to do is you'll need to do slightly more hard work working out how to spread out those colours. But what I will say is when you've got your pattern, whether that's printed or whether that's PDF, what you have got in here is the diagram of all the panels like this, and so you could even colour that in. So say you're making a plan for using 3 colours, what I would advise really would be to actually colour these panels in so that you can see the spread of your colours over that blanket. Or if you are somebody using up all your scraps and ends, I've seen a lot of blankets where you're going to be using lots and lots of different colours, just go with it and just see where those colours will naturally end up as you continue crocheting into the blanket. So the other thing, just to clarify, is the USA terms. So I am a British crocheter using British terms, which means in this pattern I have used occasionally the double crochet, which is the US single crochet. By and large, we've used the treble, which is the double USA terms. So the British treble, which is the double in USA terms. And then occasionally we've also used the British half treble, which is the half double in USA terms. So I have flagged that as we've obviously gone through that day of the video, but just to flag once again for anyone watching who's more used to USA terms, these are stated in British terms as I go through and demonstrate them. So in terms of right-handed and left-handed, a really good question that I tried to address as we went throughout. But basically, what we've been doing is every time we rotate to join on the next panel, as a right-handed crochet, we've been going the opposite way round to those that would be doing it left-handed. But what we've now actually done is we've done an update to the PDF that means that you can download a left-handed chart. So if you would like all the panel numbers to be in the correct place if you are left-handed, just get in touch with us, help@toftuk.com, and we'll send you a left-handed numbered panels so you can just double check that yours are going in the place that you want them to be. So just get in touch if you are left-handed and you'd like that clarification. Right. Yesterday I covered horizontal versus vertical. So this is something just to address that as you go through your pattern, some of the stitches work horizontally and vertically, some don't. Some will only work on one or the other. So go and watch yesterday's video if you have any questions about what horizontal or vertical means in brackets. It's covered really thoroughly in yesterday's video. But one small thing I just want to clarify is when you get to panel 12, which is a bobble panel, on row 3, you are trebling across to the end. Now we've just realised that the two little words to end is there. It tells you to treble, it doesn't say to end, but of course it is to end as you go across that row. So just on row 3 of panel 12, you are trebling right the way across to the end in exactly the same way as you've done on every other bobble panel you've done. There's no specific change for panel 12. Right side and wrong side, one more question. So Right side and wrong side, there is a definite right side. That's where your stitch marker will have been. So at this stage when we're going to wash and block, you can just remove that. You don't need to have that in anymore at all. And the right side is the one that your bubbles have ended up coming out of the front of, despite the fact that we've been working them on the wrong side. Now, this is one thing that I think some of you, before we did the videos, it took a little bit of getting used to, is although we have done classic stitches like the waffle stitch, because of us thinking about the fact that we're constantly working the panels in the same, we've actually in some cases inverted those stitches. So just to clarify then, normally a waffle stitch, for example, you would be doing front posts and then back posts. So front post first and then back post. We've done it where you're doing a back post waffle rather than a front post one. This is just to make sure that we're always landing you the right side of the stitches on the right side of the blanket. So we've done the hard work there for you. You just have to go with it. But do be aware, sometimes you will be making these classic patterns, but in reverse, so inverted rather than right side facing. Last thing then really is if you lose track of where you are in terms of your pattern, I think that's something that a few people have asked about really, is if you lose track of where you are in the pattern. Obviously, by and large, they are going to be approximately the same size panel as they were previously. But I just want to really point out before I block how wonky mine is. They're not identical sizes at this stage because all these stitches are pulling in slightly different directions, tension-wise, and obviously directions from each other. When we block now, that will all even out. So don't worry. When you are doing it, believe your row count as you go through your pattern. So just tick off those row counts as you go along. It's not that they will always be exactly to the right squared off length as the others, and you don't need to change your tension or your hook size or anything to accommodate for that. The blocking will do all hard work for you. So when it comes to sewing in ends, you'll likely have two types of ends on this blanket. Ones where you joined in yarn, and then ones that truly come off your corners. But you can treat them in exactly the same way. So a few of these I've already got too excited and actually sewn them in. This one here I haven't. So what you need to do is get a wool needle, and it's a skinny one that I've got here, but a regular one would work. And when it's an end one, these end ones are totally secure. So this is where you either tied a slip knot where you started, or where you actually finish by pulling that yarn through. They're secure and they're not going to unravel, but you just want to disguise them inside the colour that you've come out of. So what you want to do is sew in and around within the colour of the panel that you're doing. And what I do is I almost mimic the stitch. So there, I've come up the treble and I'm going to secure it off on the next one. But what I would say is sew in the ends like this before you block. Then we'll block and then we'll snip them off. So don't snip them off now, because you'll find that when all those stitches and the fabric relaxes when we block, your ends might wriggle their way out again. So sew them in, but leave them like that. Now, you're likely not going to have one like this because you'll have a border on yours when you finally finish, but I'll put it in just so you can see it. So all I'm doing this time is I'm going to sew along, mimicking those stitches like that, staying within that colour panel. Now, when it comes to the ones where you joined in yarn, these are probably the most important ones, because what we had here is we didn't tie a knot or anything like that. We actually just swapped over from one colour to the other. So this is the one, the end that's coming from this side, and this is the one that's coming from this side. But what I'm actually going to do when I sew them in place is move them away from each other like that. So the one that's coming from the bottom here, when I sew that in place, what I'm going to do is sew upwards around this front post, back post rib, but away from the other one, upwards over here. And all I'm doing is sewing to mimic the stitch like that, up that front post treble. You can go as far as you want to. I'm always cautious with these ones because these are the ones that if at any point in the future you're ever going to get something unravel, it'll be one of these ones that causes the trouble. It's never going to be those start and finish ones. So I would say these are the ones where you've joined in a new colour within a panel. These are the ones that you need to be most careful of. So I've sewn that one up the way, which means I'm going to sew this one down the way. So basically they've crossed away from each other and secured themselves in really well. like that. And again, I'm leaving that end on because when we block it, they might move a little bit more, and then I'll snip them all off at the end. So once you're happy that you've got all those ends sewn in, now we're going to wash and block our blankets. Now, this isn't because the wool needs washing in terms of it being dirty or anything like that. It really is to settle these stitches down so that it evens up any difference in the size of the panels so it sits nice and flat. So what I've got here is actually lukewarm water, and then I will be using soak, which is a no rinse wash. Now obviously my panel's absolutely tiny. Your blanket when it finishes might be huge, so you might even have to go to your kitchen sink or your bathtub if it's a really big one. But the great thing about a product like soak is the fact that you don't have to rinse it off afterwards. So it's not a lot that you need to put in at all. That's a tiny little drop that I've put in there because obviously I'm just doing this little sample piece. It's not a lot of the product that you'll need at all. It's really the water that's going to be doing the hard work. And then put your blanket in, and because we're not really washing it, it's not that it's dirty, although in future you would use exactly the same process. So if you are going to use this blanket, maybe you've got a busy home, you've got dogs, you've got everything like I have, you know, at some horrible point you might find some hot chocolate gets put on it. You will be able to absolutely wash this in future using exactly the same method, which is the easiest method because you don't have to rinse it afterwards. So I would leave that for kind of 10-15 minutes just to make sure it really has absorbed the water. If it's very dirty in the future, then you might find you want to leave it a little bit longer than that to make sure that the soak's doing the hard work for you. So just leave it in like that so that it's really saturated with the water. So then when you come back to it, what you want to do is you do want to wring it out. Now, I know that this is something that I've obviously been quite controversial in the past on, where people are like, oh, she's being very rough with that. I'm rough with everything, and I've never, ever had an issue. So I would wring this out, and I wouldn't be too worried about being too precious with it. What you don't want is it to be too wet. Now, again, this is going to be quite a struggle with your big one. So just go steady, do it while you're still in the bath, but you want to try and wring it out to get it as dry as you can before we then go on to do the blocking. Now, when it comes to the blocking, I'm a big believer in using what you've got at home until you're somebody that's necessarily going to need the equipment to do a lot more of it. So normally we would block on a yoga mat, something like that. So it means that it's not going to be wet. So those kind of squishy play mats, yoga mats, that's a great thing to be able to block on because you can push the pins in and it's non-absorbent. But if you haven't got something like that, the best thing to use really is a towel. All you'll need to be aware of is obviously the towel will get wet, and so you might need to change the towel for a dry one once it's kind of done its first stage of drying. But I think this time of year, everyone's starting to consider putting their heating on. So it should be okay. If you're going in your house and you're getting your heating on, it should actually dry relatively fast, even though it is sitting on a towel. So this is it on a towel here, and all I'm trying to do here is basically even out these blocks while it's wet, and you'll be surprised by how fluid the fabric comes immediately as soon as you wet it like this. And what we're then looking to do is basically just square up all your panels as much as you can so that it will dry nice and flat in that position. And stitches like this, which in some ways were the most live when we first crocheted them because they're so springy in terms of putting in all those stitches, instantly relax and block out to be a totally square, flat piece of fabric. But let's just talk about blocking pins a second, because if you are somebody who is particularly intent on making this totally square, what you can always do is you can use blocking pins, of which I don't seem to have any blocking pins here, but I've got a lot of skinny wool needles. And with your blocking pins, what you can do is on any tricky squares, which is likely to be this rib, is you can actually just make sure that even within the blanket, you block out those tricky squares like that by putting those pins in the corners, and that will give an extra layer of strength to hold in those square ones. Most of the rest of them really won't need it. It's likely to be your basket weave and your rib that are your most tricky ones in terms of wanting them to square up to block out. So really, if that's what you're going for and you want to make sure it's absolutely perfect, then you put your blocking pins just on the corners of those panels, even within your blanket, while it's wet like this, and you will find that then they'll absolutely block out square and flat. Now, if you want to, there is a thing called a blocking wire that you can use. It's not something that I would ever really use on a blanket. It would only ever be on something like lace work or shawl. But if you want to, you could always add the wires into the edges. What a blocking wire is a straight wire that you work through the edge and then you use the pins to block that out. So you can get an absolutely perfect square edge if you want to by using blocking wires on something like this. But that's not something that I would ever do on a blanket. The blanket that will be going in my house is going to be a blanket that gets used quite often, so I'm not too worried about it being totally square. It's more important for me that it feels super snuggly, and so I've got a feeling that I'm not going to be too worried about it having completely square edges. You will need to obviously take this off once that's soaked in for a while, because your towel will go wet, and swap it onto a dry one or a new one. But if you go for not using pins and just really lying it out, it's not a big deal to actually do that. You'll have no problem lying that out flat again. Then once it's totally dry, the very, very last stage will be to snip off these ends. And the reason why we do that is, if you'd sewn them in and then snip them off before doing the blocking, what you're likely to find is that the stitches move around quite a lot when we block. And so you'll end up with little ends sticking out again. So always with everything, to get the neatest effect, sew them in, but don't snip them off. Leave them off like this, dry it, and then snip them off at the very end, and you will then get the neatest effect. So I hope all of this has been great tips to help you, whether you're making this blanket or other blankets as well. I absolutely look forward to seeing your finished products. Right, I'm off to go and do quite a few more rows here on my next panel. I'm going to start as I mean to go on, hoping that by Christmas I've got something that is almost as big as my sofa. So that's my list of questions. Thank you so much for joining me. Please share your pictures of your blanket as you finish. It's an odd one for me because normally with a crochet along, when we finish off the last day, I can see everyone's pictures of their finished projects. But I know that this one, it's going to be quite a few days, weeks, months, possibly years, as you are working on your blanket. I know that I have very high hopes for mine. I've not even yet signed off where I think I'm going to stop. I would love to think that I can find time over the next few months to go really big across the back of the sofa. But we shall see. I've set the challenge. I will try and do it myself as well. Time to do some really long rows. As you get up there will be lovely big long rows, so nice relaxing crochet where you can watch TV at the same time as well. Now you've mastered those stitches. So thank you once again. I hope you'll join me again on a crochet along. We've got another one coming up before Halloween even. So Philippe the Gargoyle, you can join me for just the lead into Halloween really. It's like an advent but a countdown to Halloween as we make a gargoyle. Thank you very much.